I've always believed that if you really want to understand people, you watch them when no one's watching. That's why, even after all these years, with all the blessings I've been given, I still take commercial flights. I could fly private. I could skip the lines, the noise, the small talk. But sometimes the best lessons in life don't happen in luxury. They happen in the middle seat at 30,000 feet. That morning, I was heading from Los Angeles to New York. It was just another cross-country trip, or so I thought. I booked a seat in business class like any other traveler. No entourage, no assistants, no red carpet, just me, my carry-on, and a quiet desire to disappear into the crowd for a while. Some of the airline staff recognized me. They greeted me politely, whispering to each other, but I asked them to keep it low-key. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted to see the world from the same window as everyone else. Boarding was smooth at first, the usual shuffle of people searching for overhead space, the clinking of seat belts, the murmured calls to loved ones before takeoff. Everything was calm until I heard a voice, sharp, loud, impatient. A young man, maybe in his early 30s, was standing a few rows ahead of me, arguing with the flight attendant about his seat. He was dressed sharp, designer everything, a watch that probably cost more than the ticket. His tone carried that edge of entitlement that money sometimes gives to the wrong people. He kept saying things like, "Do you know who I am? And I paid for this seat. I don't care what your system says." The attendant, a woman named Sarah, stayed calm. She explained that his ticket didn't match the seat he was demanding. But he wasn't listening, he was performing. Loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. I watched quietly. You learn a lot by observing before speaking. The people around him shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen, but hanging on every word. I could feel the energy changing, that uncomfortable silence that fills a space when pride walks in. The man kept pushing, calling her incompetent, demanding a supervisor. Sarah kept her composure like a professional. She apologized, offered to check the manifest again, but he only grew louder, leaning back in his seat with the kind of arrogance that fills every corner of the room. I sat there thinking, this right here is what tests us. Not the big challenges, not the cameras, not the awards. It's how we treat people who serve us when nobody else is watching. As the engine started humming, I glanced out the window and said quietly to myself, I've learned that how a person treats those who serve them tells you everything you need to know about who they really are. That flight hadn't even taken off yet, but the lesson had already begun. The moment the seatbelt sign dimmed, that same young man started again. The attitude hadn't left him. It had just been waiting for an audience. He rang the call button like it owed him something, snapping his fingers for attention. When the flight attendant, Sarah, returned, he leaned back and said, I paid more than half these people on this plane combined. I expect to be treated accordingly. His voice carried down the aisle, sharp enough for everyone to hear. I stayed quiet. Years of being in front of the camera have taught me one thing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of noise is stay silent. That silence makes the truth louder. Sarah tried to reason with him. She explained that the system couldn't change his assigned seat mid-flight, that someone else had already purchased the one he wanted. But entitlement doesn't listen, it only talks. He waved her off with a dismissive flick of his hand, saying, "Just move them. I'm sure they won't mind once you tell them who I am." The passengers around us shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between curiosity and irritation. You could feel the tension tighten the air like a rubber band ready to snap. I could tell Sarah was holding herself together, polite smile, steady tone, but I saw the tremor in her fingers when she adjusted her badge. That kind of disrespect wears on a person, especially when they're just trying to do their job. The man then decided he was done talking. He simply stood up, grabbed his bag, and slid into the seat. He wanted one belonging to an older woman who looked too startled to object. The rest of the cabin froze. That's when I finally spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough for him to hear me. I said, "Sir, sometimes following the rules isn't about control, it's about respect." He turned his head toward me with that slow, deliberate smirk that people wear when they think they're untouchable. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. I smiled. "No," I said, "but I think I'm starting to." The look he gave me was the same look I've seen 1,000 times in this world, the one that says power makes a man forget he's human. Sarah stepped in again, calm as ever, asking him to please return to his seat. But before he could answer, the cabin door opened and the captain himself walked down the aisle. You could feel the shift immediately authority had entered the room. Still, even as the captain spoke to him, the man rolled his eyes, acting as though the rules didn't apply to him. I just sat there, hands folded, watching. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. Sometimes arrogance destroys itself faster than any confrontation could. And as I looked at that man, refusing to move, refusing to listen, I thought quietly to myself, I didn't need to judge him. His words already did that for me. The tension on that plane was so thick you could almost hear it hum beneath the engines. People stopped pretending to read, stopped scrolling their phones. Every eye flicked toward the same man, the one who had turned a simple flight into a stage for his ego. The flight attendant, Sarah, was doing her best. I could see it, that professional smile stretched thin, the quiet tremor in her voice as she tried to keep things calm. But sometimes calm feels like weakness to people who crave control. He looked at her not with eyes that saw another human being, but like she was an obstacle between him and what he thought he deserved. After a few more minutes of arguing, she excused herself to speak with the captain. Moments later, the cabin door opened and the pilot himself, a tall, steady man, with the quiet confidence of someone who's seen storms before, walked down the aisle. You could tell the situation had reached a point where authority had to intervene. He crouched slightly beside the passenger and spoke in a low tone, the kind of voice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. "Sir, you need to cooperate. We can't take off until everyone is seated in their assigned place." But arrogance doesn't yield easily. The man leaned back, arms crossed, smirk still in place. "You can't possibly expect me to sit back there," he said. "I'm not paying for that. I'm paying for comfort, for respect." I could see the captain take a slow breath, keeping his composure. Sarah stood nearby, still as stone, her eyes darting between them. And I sat just a few rows away, feeling the quiet weight of the moment, that thin line between pride and principle. So I stood up, not to make a scene, not to take sides, but to lower the temperature in the room. If it helps, I said gently, I can take his seat. Let's just keep things peaceful. The man turned, his eyes narrowing at me. And who are you supposed to be? He asked, his tone dripping with disdain. I smiled. No one important, I said. Just someone who thinks we all have a responsibility to make things easier, not harder. He laughed, that hollow kind of laugh people use when they feel challenged. You don't get it, old man. You don't know who you're talking to. I looked him straight in the eye and said, no, but I think I know what kind of man I'm talking to. The laughter stopped. For a second, silence filled the space where arrogance had lived. The captain gave one final warning, either comply or leave the plane. After a long pause, the man finally slumped into the correct seat, muttering something under his breath. The cabin exhaled. You could almost hear people's shoulders unclench. I sat back down, folded my hands, and looked out the window. And as the plane began to taxi down the runway, I thought to myself, I didn't need power to teach him a lesson, just patience. Because sometimes dignity speaks louder than authority ever could. Once the captain returned to the cockpit and the seatbelt sign chimed, the cabin settled into that quiet rhythm of a long haul, pages turning, ice clinking, fans purring in the vents. The young man who'd made so much noise earlier went still. He stared straight ahead like a statue that didn't want to be looked at. Every now and then he glanced my way and then pretended he hadn't. I let the quiet do its work. I've learned that not every lesson needs a lecture. I opened the paperback I tucked into my jacket, read the same paragraph 3 times, and finally just closed the cover. My mind wasn't on the words. It was on the people. Sarah came by the aisle with the beverage cart. Up close, you could see the thin edge of fatigue behind her professionalism, the kind you only notice if you've stood in other people's storms. Coffee, sir? She asked. Please, I said, and a little time to breathe if you can find any. That made her smile. She poured, set the cup on my tray, and I said quietly, you handled yourself well back there. Calm under fire is a rare gift. She dipped her head, humble. Thank you, sir. We see all kinds. The hardest part isn't the rules. It's remembering to be kind when you're being tested. That's the job, I said, and the calling. She moved on, and the cartwheels whispered down the aisle like a metronome. The young man's shoulders loosened a fraction. He asked for water. His voice came out smaller than before. Sarah treated him with the same care she'd given everyone else. That's dignity. Consistent even when it's not returned. A little later, the captain's voice came over the intercom steady, measured, thanking everyone for their patience, promising a smooth ride the rest of the way. When he stepped out for a brief restroom break, he paused by my row. He didn't make a show of it, just a nod, the kind men passed when words would be too loud. Appreciate the help, he murmured. I just stood up, I said. You did the heavy lifting. He smiled. Sometimes standing up is the heavy lifting, he replied, and went on his way. The cabin dimmed. Screens glowed in the dark like small private stages. I looked around at the faces, a mother tracing circles on her baby's back, a student highlighting lines in a textbook, an older couple sharing earbuds in an old movie. A plane is a strange church, strangers strapped into the same future, dependent on one another's restraint and grace for a few quiet hours. I thought about how many times in my life I'd been the loudest voice in the room when I should have been the calmest presence. Age teaches you economy. Fewer words, more weight. The longer I sat there, the more I felt something release, like a knot unwinding. Not everything needs an answer. Some things just need an example. Before the descent began, the young man stood to stretch, then turned halfway toward me. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. He gave the smallest nod, nothing anyone else would notice, and sat back down. I didn't respond with a speech. I nodded back and went on reading a page I still wasn't absorbing. That was enough. When the attendants did their final checks, Sarah stopped by one more time. All good? She asked. All good, I said. You keep doing it like that and you'll make more landings than arguments. She laughed softly, thanked me, and moved on. The plane tilted toward the Atlantic winds and the lights of the coast. People think change comes with thunder. Sometimes it arrives on tiptoe, wrapped in ordinary minutes. As wheels and wind argued beneath us and the cabin braced for touchdown, I found myself thinking a simple thought I've carried for years, but keep relearning in new ways. Sometimes silence is the deepest mirror of a person. We touched down just ahead of schedule. That soft two-step bounce that tells you a pro is on the yoke. Everyone sprang to their feet like it was a foot race, tugging at bags that never want to leave the overheads. I stayed seated, hands folded, unhurried. I've learned there's a kind of grace in being the last to stand. Sarah came by the row and thanked me again, still not knowing who I was, only knowing how I'd chosen to behave. I told her the thanks belonged to her crew, and I meant it. At the jet bridge, I kept my cap low and my voice lower. No pictures, no fuss. I had business at the airport, real business. Upstairs, past security doors and blank corridors that smell like coffee and jet fuel, there's a conference room we use when I'm in town. Routine operations review. Nothing glamorous. Cost lines, on-time performance, crew support. The unglamorous heartbeats that keep an airline alive. I arrived a few minutes early, set my notebook on the table, and greeted the team as they trickled in operations, customer care, finance, union reps. We made small talk that wasn't small at all. Staffing on red-eye turns, layover safety, how to keep good people. Then the door opened again, and a new face stepped in, young, polished, expensive. He looked familiar in the way trouble sometimes does. It took him half a second longer than it took me. His eyes swept the table, then landed on me and froze. You could watch it happen. Confusion, recognition, Panic, a dozen calculations sprinting across his face and tripping over each other. He was the same passenger from 18C, the one who'd tried to bulldoze his way through our rules. Only now he had a leather portfolio under his arm and a scheduled slot on our agenda as a potential partner for a co-branded program. I stood, not to loom, just to shorten the distance between who he'd been on the plane and who he could be in this room. "Looks like we meet again," I said. Silence gathered like a jury. He opened his mouth, closed it, glanced toward the exit, then remembered the only door worth using was the one straight ahead. He shook my hand. His was colder than mine. We took our seats. The team began the presentation numbers, projections, marketing language that sounded confident because marketing language is trained to. I listened, but I also watched the man across from me. The swagger he'd worn at 35,000 feet had been checked with his bag. In its place was something I respect: discomfort. The honest kind that means you're seeing yourself without makeup. When the decks were done, I asked the room to give us 5 minutes. They filed out, leaving the two of us with the hum of recycled air and the weight of unfinished business. "I'm not here to embarrass you," I said, "and I'm not here to relitigate a flight that's already landed. But before we talk about partnership, we have to talk about people, specifically how you treat them when you think they can't do anything for you." He stared at the table edge, then at his hands. "I was out of line," he said. "No excuses. No weather report about stress. Just the sentence that matters." "I appreciate that," I said. "But understand, our brand doesn't start on a billboard. It starts in the aisle, with Sarah, with the captain, with the man in 22B who just needs to get home. If you want to be attached to us, you need to honor that out loud and in writing." He nodded, slow and heavy. "What do you need from me?" "3 things," I said. "A personal apology to the crew who bore the brunt of your bad day. A commitment in your company and in ours to training that centers dignity, not just dollars. And your word that the person who walked onto that airplane isn't the person who walked into our partnership." His eyes finally met mine. Less glass, more water. "You have it," he said. I called the team back in. We resumed the work. Clauses, dates, responsibilities. But the real decision had already been made, not by me, but by the man who chose to be different than he'd been 2 hours earlier. I asked the team for the room again. The door clicked shut, and the noise of the terminal faded to a hush. Just the two of us now. No audience, no stage directions, no applause to drown out the truth. I took a breath the way I do before a hard scene. Slow in, slow out, then let the silence do a little of the work. "Listen," I said, "I'm not angry. I'm accountable. That's different." He looked confused, so I clarified. Accountable to Sarah, to the captain, to every passenger who watched that unfold and wondered what we stand for. He nodded, eyes down. I could see the instinct to defend himself gather and then drop away like a suitcase that finally gives up its handle. I didn't rush him. When a man is wrestling with himself, the worst thing you can do is climb into the ring. I'm not here to dress you down, I continued. I'm here to draw a line you can step over if you choose. I've crossed my share of lines in life, said things I can't unsay, carried an ego that walked into the room 10 minutes before I did. Fame can make you deaf. Entitlement can make you blind. I've felt both, and they never made me better. I let that sit. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. He swallowed. I was wrong, he said, barely above a whisper. Good, I said, because that sentence is a key. It opens doors that money can't. I pointed to the chair where he'd sat on the plane. You didn't just take a seat. You took up more space than your ticket allowed. We all do it sometimes on planes, in meetings, in life. The work is learning to shrink the ego and expand the respect. He met my eyes at last and stayed there. That's a start. Here's what happens next, I said. Not punishment, practice. I want you to write personal apologies to Sarah, to the captain, to the service team who absorbed your storm. Not a press release, not lawyered language, your words, your responsibility. Then I want you to set up dignity training for your own staff, something real, not a box to tick. Bring that learning back to the partnership we're discussing. And finally, I want your commitment that what we saw on that flight was an episode, not a character trait. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since pushback from the gate. I'll do all of it, he said. No excuses. You'll be tempted to make them, I warned, a small smile softening the truth. Stress, deadlines, the million reasons we give ourselves to be less than decent. You'll hear those reasons knocking. Don't open the door. He nodded again, slower this time, and something in his posture gave like a suit shoulder, finally relaxing into a human being. I've never had someone say it to me straight and still leave me standing, he said. Then hear it straight, I answered. We don't need perfect partners. We need teachable ones. We need people who can be corrected without being crushed. I opened the door and invited the team back in. Their faces held questions. I answered with a glance that said, we're okay, keep going. We returned to terms and timelines, to marketing, windows, and service metrics. But there was new oxygen in the room, the kind that doesn't come from ventilation. Respect changes the air. When the meeting wrapped, I walked him to the threshold. No speech, no sermon, just a hand on his shoulder, the kind a father gives a son when he's chosen the harder right instead of the easier wrong. Follow through, I said. Integrity is keeping a promise after the mood you made it in has passed. He looked me squarely in the face. I will. As he left, a few of our people lingered. I could see it in their expressions, the relief that comes when leadership chooses restoration instead of spectacle. I told them what I tell myself every morning. Forgiveness is not softness. Forgiveness is strength under control. It insists on truth, and it leaves the door unlocked for change. Then I picked up my notebook, the same way I had picked up my carry-on earlier that day, lightly, intentionally, and we got back to work. A few weeks later, an envelope showed up on my desk, handwritten, no assistant stamp, no company watermark trying to clean it up. I knew who it was from before I opened it. I took a breath, slid a finger under the flap, and read every line. It wasn't polished, it wasn't pretty, it was honest. He owned what he'd said on that plane, the contempt, the posturing, the way he treated people whose only job that day was to get a few hundred souls safely across the country. He wrote to Sarah by name, to the captain, to the ground crew he'd never met but had disrespected in the abstract. He didn't excuse it with stress or deadlines or the weight of a deal. He wrote, "I forgot the person in front of me is a person. I'm sorry." I folded the letter, sat with it a minute, and felt something loosen inside me, the kind of exhale you don't notice you're holding until it leaves. I made a copy for our records and another for Sarah. When I handed it to her, she didn't gloat and she didn't grin. She nodded, the way pros do when decency circles back around. That's strength too. In an interview not long after, somebody asked me what the real story was. I told them it wasn't about a seat, it wasn't about celebrity or status or who could throw the bigger shadow. This story, I said, is about how we behave when no one we think is important is watching. It's about what leaks out of us when our wants hit a boundary. Respect isn't an industry standard. It's a daily decision. I've been around bright lights and red carpets long enough to know the truth. Fame fades, money moves, titles turn over. The only thing that makes it past the closing credits is character. The kindness you practice when it costs you convenience. The patience you choose when you're pressed for time. The discipline to say, "I was wrong," and the courage to live the apology with your action. So here's what I want you to hear from me, not as a headline, not as a lesson from a podium, just as a man who keeps learning. Treat people the way you want to be treated when you're tired, when you're late, when you're sure you deserve more. Tip your hat to the person pouring your coffee. Thank the one who lifts your bag. Listen when the rule isn't built around you. Don't wait for a lounge or a boardroom to remind you that dignity is not a perk, it's a baseline. That day on the plane, I didn't need to win. I needed to witness. I needed to prove to myself that authority can sit quietly, that strength can walk softly, that accountability can still leave the door open. And I needed to remember, again, that all the temporary things, status, deals, applause, are only scaffolding. What stands when the scaffolding comes down is who you are. If you take one thing from this, let it be this line. I've come to believe with my whole heart, because respect isn't given by title, it's earned by heart. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor, like this, subscribe for more conversations like it, and drop a comment with your own moment of choosing respect when it was hard. Share it with someone who needs a reminder today. Let's keep each other honest and keep each other human.